We're live. Okay, here we go. I'm going to move this page so I don't forget. I'll just put it over here. Okay, so we're going to create a very simple Silex application. We're going to use the Star Wars API, and we're going to just kind of step through it step by step. You guys can either follow along or you can. We're live. Okay, here we go. Okay, obviously there is some conflict going on. So, oh, there I am. Okay. Preferably just have one Google Hangout going. Okay, we're still live. Now I'm gonna make a directory. You guys can either follow on or just watch. I don't care. I'm gonna call this Star Wars. Capital F. That's annoying. I'm just gonna init a composer. It's a good name. It's a good description. Good author. Beautiful. Is anyone following along, or can I just go as fast as I want?
Well, we can just watch. Yeah.
Okay. Is that fine with you, Nate?
Yeah.
Okay. So I've just created that. I'm just going to do a composer require Silex. Nope. The GitHub is Silex PHP, but the composer, I guess they figure using PHP.
Makes sense.
And I probably should have done this. There it goes. Okay, let's go ahead. I'm going to make a web directory and do my work inside of the web. And let's open that up. Yeah, I'm going to do that, not inside of web. Okay, so let's just create a simple PHP file. Is that big enough?
Yeah.
Bring in the autoloader.
Package name.
Silex.
Capital S.
Lowercase s, both lowercase, S-I-L-E-X. Oh, stupid editor config. Let me just get an editor config real quick. So it's a little bit of copy. Okay, so this is going to be your simplest Silex application. You basically do a new application, you set up all your routes, what you want your routes to do, and then you run the application. So what we've done here is we've created a route that only works with a get method. The route is /hello, and it's going to return the string hi. Let's see it working. So I'm just going to use a PHP server. And so let's turn on debug real quick as well so we can see the errors. So to turn on debug in Silex, you can just do app debug true. And that will let you see kind of a larger stack trace when you hit an error. In this case, it's going to be route not found because we didn't define a slash. We only defined slash hello, or yeah. So that should have returned the word hi. That was super impressive. Hi, Russell. Oh, there it is. It's just covered up because I'm in presentation mode. Let's get out of presentation mode and go back to full screen. Okay, so you can see you can just return a string and it outputs it. If we wanted a different route at index, we would just create another route that does what it wants. Now we have two routes, one at index and one at hello. Simple as Silex gets. Obviously, you can do more complex things. You can start putting parameters in here. Parameters just have curly brackets around them. They get passed as arguments to your controller. And then you can just do that. Now if we go to hello, doesn't work because that route's not there anymore, but if you do hello, hi, and you get hi. Hello, Nate. Hi, Nate. Mark. Amazing. If you wanted to provide a default value for an argument, just at the after you do your controller, you can do value, the name of it, and what the default value is. So now, if we don't specify what that is, we can go back to hello, and just as our route, that is now defined, and it's just doing a hi world. But if we do specify it, we get hi Russell. Okay. This application is a pimple container, pimple being a dependency injection container. You can put values inside of it. It kind of looks like an array, and you can just treat it like an array. So we're putting Russell as the name default, and then we can just use that here instead of hard coding it in. And now that can be done like in an external config file or something. And so now if I just go there, that's going to be the default value. And as I change this in the pimple container, it obviously changes. But you don't just have to put static things in there. You can have it be a function. So maybe this is returning a random number between 1 and 100. And we're just going to do that. So hello 9, hello 63. So you can see it's doing the return value of that. But what I want to show there, let me just bring the application in. So I want to use the application inside of this controller now. So just to use that, you can just type, if you type it with application, you can name this whatever you want. Silex will pass that to you automatically just because it sees that you're requesting the application. Now I can do that again. So I'm going to do default name twice. You can see each time that's a different value. So anytime we're asking for name default, it's calling the function. And so you're going to get different values for each one of those. Sometimes that's what you want, sometimes that's not what you want. Sometimes you just want it to happen once and just use that return value. So if you want it to just happen once, you wrap it in an app share. Now that that's an app share, it's only getting called once, and the response from that method is now stored inside of that pimple container. So I'm going to get the same numbers twice. No matter how many times I call that, it's always going to be 84. So when you wrap it in an app share, the function runs once, and then the value is stored in here like it was this one, and it will be used every time. There's also app protect, which you don't see happen. We don't use that a lot currently in Utah new. That returns a function for you to execute yourself. So similar to with it not being a function, but this allows you to do like arguments in here, like upper bound. And then you could say you can see those have different ranges. App protect isn't used tons. You might use it in your complex providers with Mongo, I think is one place I saw that being used. But usually you're going to be doing an app share or just a raw value is what I see most of the time. Okay, let's switch this out for our Star Wars API. Typically what you'll use the dependency container for is for dependencies. So we're going to have a dependency upon the Star Wars API. We want to set that up once and then share that dependency throughout our controllers. So I'm going to bring in the Star Wars API real quick. Just do version. Well, just copy this part because I don't know what version I want. So this is just a Guzzle SDK for the Star Wars API. Okay. So I'm going to create Swappy. I don't want a parameter with that. And I'm just going to return. I guess I don't really need that. It's going to be and then let's do a character. Hi. Let's do their ID. This. Okay, so now let's get that character from the API. So we want to, again, pull that out from the dependency container, and then we can just treat it like an object. So we're going to do characters get ID is how that API works, and that returns an array. And let's just show this real quick. If you don't know, you can have this return a JSON response pretty easy. You can do app.json and pass in an array, and that will give you a nice formatted JSON response. So let's just see what this character looks like. And it's now character 1, character hi 1, character let me make sure my auto generator, it's Swappy, right? New Swappy. Let's just do use. Do it. Not found on line 12. Line 12, new Swappy. Let's just dump our autoloader real quick. Let's just do that. Composer, dump autoload. Why is it not that? Swappy, share. Is it not new? Oops.
Oh, you have another part.
I know it as a function, but we'll try it without. It shouldn't matter. Well, that's impressive. App share. It's in there, right? Swappy. Source, swappy. Okay, let me look at the one I did last night real quick. No, not the web though. Let's just copy this one. It still looks the same, right? Let's try it. Okay. Vendor, auto load, PSR4. Sorry, this is vendor. This worked beautifully for me. What are we doing? Oh, how did I do that? Okay, it helps if you only have one vendor file and one composer JSON instead of two. So I accidentally installed it in my web directory. So I need to do that again. Composer require rmasters floppy. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, now that will work. Okay, so you can see it gave us a JSON response. If you look at the headers, it should have set up those headers right for us. So you can see it's doing an application JSON content type and converted that array for us. So here's our structure. We can see we can grab name. So instead of doing that JSON, we can do hi. Except it's an object. Hi, Lake Skywalker. Amazing. One thing that people, one option that Silex provides is to convert that before you pass it to the controller. So what we could do, instead of doing the conversion here, we can do the conversion here. Now we get a swappy models character. I'm going to rename that parameter character. So it makes more sense. All we've done is we just moved that logic out here to a converter. Obviously that's not perfect, but it's a good place to start. We need to use app here, so let's go ahead and get application here. And now we don't need application up here. Move that application down. Let's get number 2, just so we get something new. What is it complaining about? Argument 2, pass to closure must be an instance of Silex application. That's correct. So converters only get requests. They don't do the type hint, so we have to use a closure and pass the app this way. That's probably something you're not super familiar with. This takes a variable external from the function, which is defined up here, and passes it into the function as kind of not an argument. So arguments get passed when the function's called. This gets passed kind of when the function's defined. There you go. Hello, C3PO. You can also break that out into a function to make it more reusable. So we can have like a character converter. Let's just copy paste that. Then we can use that here. That makes it so if we need to reuse it for another thing, we can use it for our high, and we can use it for our phi. Okay? So the converters lets you kind of separate that logic out to make it more reusable. Typically, you kind of want to keep, obviously you can do everything inline here, but you eventually want to start breaking things out into their own individual files. And so Symfony will provide a, you can create providers and services to kind of move things out. I'm going to change this to a service real quick. So I'm going to call this the Swappy Character Converter and do an app share there. Well, we don't need to do an app share yet. We can just put that right in here. And we can use that instead. I thought I had my invites turned off. Goodbye. Let's actually go ahead and do that all as converters. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new source, and let's just do this as a full-on converter. Converter, and let's create a new object. We'll call this character converter. A starcom converter class converter. Really, we just need public function construct public function convert. Let's move just these over. And let's see, we want to have, we'll need the app container. Well, we'll just need Swappy. So protected Swappy. We'll actually just pass Swappy in here instead. And this will return like that. So let's do Swappy. Okay, so that's that. So now what we can do here is return a new instance of our character converter passing in our dependencies. Let's add our use star com converter. And then we can come here and we just do the name of the container and then colon the method we want to call. So that could be anything, it doesn't have to be convert. And that moves all of that logic to an external file. Let me add my autoload real quick so it will work. Oh, what does that look like? Just gonna steal it real quick. So that should be my autoloader. So this should all still work. We're just moving that converter externally. Let's try number, what number? 5. Leia. And so this right here is a service, and then that's allowing us to move some of that code externally. Obviously, this is not super complex, but you could have something very complex in here. And you can see it's just a normal class. It's not extending from anything. We're just passing dependencies, doing our logic, and putting it back. But you can access the service, colon, and then a method name. Another thing you can do, if you notice, if we type in by something weird, we're getting a 404 error because this is all in expecting numbers. And so we actually make a call out to the Swappy API. That Swappy API has to fail. But we know that only numbers is going to work in here, and we only need to resolve it if it's numbers. So we can come in here and say assert, and then do a regular expression. So make sure, oops, I called it character now. Make sure that's a number, and if it's not a number, the route's just not even found. So instead of going out to the API and hitting the API first with a bad call, it doesn't even try it. But once we do pass an ID in, that matches that assert, it works. Okay. Questions so far? Have write protection, or it doesn't let you write, but if you wanted to, there's post in here, there's put, there's delete, and there's patch. So you can see when we do a post, let's just do a post of like test. I'll just return, this is a test. If I come to /test with a get, there's no route found. But if I hit it with a post, I use postman to show that. Did I not call it test? Test, post, return. Oh, I don't need to convert anything. Duh. And then that route works. If you want to do everything, you can do method, and that will accept, or no, you can do matches. Let me check. I'm pretty sure it's matches. Oh, it's just match. So if you do, I'll go there. You can do app match, and it will match anything. And if you want to do like matching on the put and the post, you can do method as a additional call at the end of that and do a pipe between it, and that will let you do both put and post. Probably you just need to most of the time you'll treat those as separate, because puts for updates, post is for creates. Okay. If we could then do like a starship converter, kind of doing the same thing. And maybe we would have some methods for our starships. Ooh. And that's just great. Let's duplicate that real quick. I know this is fascinating. That should work. So we just added a starship theme real quick. We're just going to make sure it's working. Zoom goes the Death Star. You can see this kind of gets long, and we have all these providers in here. You really don't want to be doing your whole website in a single index.php file, is my guess. So one of the things that we can do is we can move all of these services that we're defining out into their own file. And so when you have a group of services that you want to register all at once into your application, you kind of create a provider wrapper around it. And a provider can mount up all of your services at once. So let's create a provider for Swappy. We're going to do a Swappy provider. And then the providers actually do have a specific interface that you need to use. So let's go find provider. Provider section. So the Silex documentation is great and has basically everything you need. Here's an example provider. I'm just going to copy that, paste that in here, and update this as needed. Start home. Okay, so there's the service provider interface, and that requires two methods. There is the register method and the boot method. Register is kind of where you create all your services. Boot is if your services need to do anything after they've been created, if they need to work with other services or something. I will show an example of that being used later. And then I can just take all of this and move it into here. Kind of self-contained it in there. I don't need to change anything. Well, I do need to bring this with me. And then we can use that provider. We can say app register to register your providers. We're going to have several providers, so I'm going to go ahead and import that namespace in. So we can do new Swappy, new provider, Swappy provider. And then this should all still work. We just moved that logic outside, but we should still get a spaceship. Zoom and goes the executor. So that's just letting you move those outside. Controllers, we're used to doing controllers, kind of not in this file. We usually have a controllers folder. Let's go ahead and move our controllers out. So we're going to have a character controller. And we'll have a starship controller. Again, these don't need to look anything special. You can just do class, namespace, starcom controller, class character controller, and then we can have, what did we have? We have a public function, hello action, and then we had our by action. And let's just copy those over. Just do character. So quick. Then we have our fly action. And we had okay, so those are all moved over. We actually have to use those controllers though. So what we want to do, if you want to use controllers externally like that, you have to bring in the controller service provider. So I'm just going to come in here and go to the default providers. Let's look at organizing controllers. Service, no, what is it? Controllers of services, there we go. So we need to register this controller service provider. And then that lets us then just go ahead and define our controllers. So we're going to have a character controller. Any dependencies. And then our starship controller. And then instead of doing the right here, just like with a converter, we can have character, controller, and this is our hello action. Our character, controller, by action. Our starship, controller, fly action. And our starship controller dot crash action. Okay, so now all of that logic files, it should still work. 12. Starship controller not found. It's helpful to add in your namespaces as needed. And then where did I spell it wrong?
Trash control.
Oh yes. Starship controller. Useful. Zoom goes the X-Wing. But now you can come in here as the TIE Fighter. And that's on an external file, so it's a little bit easier to work with and not as confusing and more in a predictable spot. Okay. But you can see all of our routes are still kind of in here, and we're still registering each controller individually. And so the next thing that people will do is create providers for their controllers. So I'm just going to do the character controller, and you guys can imagine how the Starship controller would look like. So we're going to do the character controller provider. And I am going to real quick copy this over in the interest of time. Let me add a folder to the project. So what we've got here, we have to use the service provider interface because we're doing that as service, but we also have to bring in the controller provider interface. We're creating our controller just as normal, character controller, nothing special there. But then the controller provider interface has this connect method. Inside of our connect method, we're using our application. There's a built-in thing called controllers factory. When you call that, it gives you kind of a new controller instance. So I'm just calling that the character controller. In the character controller, let me get this out. I don't want this. I don't want you to see that yet either, but whatever. We'll talk about that. Here's our route. We have hi, character, calling the hello action, the bye character, calling the bye action, and we're returning that controller. So this is where our routes are now. And then in our boot, we're mounting this controller provider onto this path. So instead of being at /hi, it's going to be at /character. Oops. It's going to be character /hi. Sorry, did I say that backwards? So if you had this called, like, if you mounted it at API character, then the route would be API character hi. If you mounted it at just /, it's just going to be /hi. But that lets you kind of keep these routes a little bit shorter and then put the prefix on when you boot it up. Some people are of the opinion that you shouldn't do this in the boot. You should make them do that themselves. That way they can put it exactly where you want. But that's more if you're kind of making packages for other people to install. We're just kind of working with our own controllers, and so if we want to mount them in a specific place, it's not going to cause a huge headache, and if we want to change it, we can come in here and change it. You can see I've moved all of my convert and assert methods directly onto the character controller. Since these are things I want to share across all my routes, I can put them directly on the controller itself, and it will automatically do all of those for any route inside of the controller. If it finds a character parameter, it will convert it, and it will force it to be a digit. So instead of having to define that every single time, it just goes directly on the controller, and it will do it every single time for every route on the controller. So let's save that and mount that up so we can get rid of all of this. And we can get rid of our character controller. And then we just register it as if it was a normal provider. So character controller provider. And then we can go character by mark number 7. I don't know who that is. But you can see it all still worked. And we could do the same thing with the spaceship controller. I'll just copy and paste it in. There's the starship controller, because the starships are cooler than spaceships. And now, this file is very simple. We have our providers, we have our controller providers, and it's kept very simple. Let's just make sure that still works. Oh, there isn't a 7. For some reason, a lot of the starship numbers are missing. The Rebel transport crashes. And this is very simple, and everything is happening kind of externally in their own files, and you can go and modify them as you want. Questions so far? For errors, like for that 404 error that we had when we did whatever number it was, we could try to catch this and throw an exception and then have Silex respond to that. I'm just going to show you in the documentation instead of doing it directly. The usage one is probably the one that goes into most depth. Oops. You can see the error handler. If you just do app error, you can catch a specific exception or generic exception and do whatever kind of response you want. They're doing a response object, but you can still just return a string or whatever. And so you would just put that right in your index. You could say app error function exception. And, oops. And let's see if you have a semicolon. Oops. It worked. It works. So you can see you can even make that further more complex. You can look at the error code and output a different template or whatever based on what the error is. You can also catch a specific exception. So if you want to handle all validation exceptions a certain way, you can have one for generic exceptions, you can have one for file not found exception or whatever, and handle those differently. So Utah.com is doing all of this and then some weird stuff because it has to work with the CMS. So if you look at Utah.com, wind that real quick. You can see we have our routes in here. And we're getting all the routes from Hive. We're looping over them. If it's a redirect type, we create a new route using the pattern from Hive. And then there's the app redirect to the redirect to. If it's a manual route, I'm going to ignore this details and logic details. We can get rid of those pretty soon. We get the pattern. We're just accepting the request, and we're getting the app and the route as kind of closures to the arguments that are being passed, not as arguments, but things that are already present. So app and route are already present. We use a page converter to convert the route data ID into a page object. And then I'm going directly to the page controller and calling page action manually on it, passing in the request and passing in the page object. And so that lets us, that's how we get to our page controller request page. And so there's not a ton of routes in our Silex application because all those routes are controlled by the CMS. And so we get those routes back and then we dynamically create those routes inside of Silex. Here's our error handler. We catch an exception. If it's debug mode, we don't handle it. We look at the code and we try to either get errors 404 twig or errors 40x twig or errors 4xx twig, and if there's none of those, just the default twig, and then we return a response with that twig template resolved using the status code. I didn't talk about response. Let's just look at response real quick. It's super simple. Instead of returning something raw, you can return a new response. Instead of response is a symphony object. And the why you'd want to use a response is so you could specify your error code or your status code, your HTTP status code. And so typically you'll see that. And you could also like set headers on it if you needed to set any custom headers and then return it. And you can see that's kind of what we're doing in Utah API. Oops, I don't have Utah API. Let me just switch this project. So our Utah API, you can see our after, we have our response, and we're setting our headers on allow, access control, origin, methods, headers. I haven't talked about after before yet, but you can see that's might be why you use a response object, is to set those kind of headers. Let's talk about after, befores, and then we can take questions or stop. I'm going to show it here. So what I've done is I've registered a before on the character controller in general, and I'm getting the request in the application. The request object, to get the query parameters, you do request query. If you want to get the post parameters, you do request request. If you don't care where it comes from, you can just do request get. So this before is saying, in the query, look for the secret, and if it's not equal to Star Wars, abort the request with a 401 and saying you don't know the secret. So abort's a way, if you don't want it, you could throw an exception and have the exception handlers handle it, or you can just call an abort and it will throw an exception for you. So if we look at this now, if we try to pull up character hi, what did we do? Oh, I don't have request defined. No, I do have request defined. Let me get rid of that error handler real quick so I can see what I did wrong. Oh, duh, you don't know the secret. But if I add secret Star Wars, response object, what did I do? Oh, I changed my controller, didn't. Let's just bring that in real quick. Oh, that response, so it's Symfony component HTTP foundation response. And let's get rid of that set header. You can see that works, and it's on both of them because again I put it on the controller. So your before and afters can be done to, that's what the security provider is doing, it's registering a before. You can do it on each individual controller, you can do it on an individual route, or you can do it across the entire application. So if we wanted to cross the entire application, we'd do an at before. We can do it just on the before on the controller, or just before after that, after the route's defined. You can also have afters that happen after your form is, after your controller is processed, but before the request, before the response is returned to the user. And then there is a finally, I think it is. These are called middlewares. The finish. The finish can also get called, but the user will never see this. This is just where you do things like logging or emailing on errors or something. But this, anytime you modify the response in a finish, the user will not see that. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of Silex. It's really a very lightweight, simple framework. It's giving you the dependency injection container, and letting you register things on it, and it has a router. Everything else is kind of up to you by providing providers or by registering different services or whatever. There's a whole bunch of default providers that you can use. Like obviously we use a Twig provider to do all of our rendering. URL generator we use to generate some of our URLs. Monologue to monologue thing or to log things. Doctrine to talk to our Mongo database and whatnot. But other than that, you can do whatever you want. Questions on Silex? Does that help at all?
Yeah.
Again, Utah.com is doing things a little bit crazy with routes. I've tried to kind of getting our converters being used, registering helpers, and kind of getting more providers in. We didn't start with a lot of providers or anything, but you can see we have a Phoenix provider where all the API keys are being set up. We have our Utah API provider, our Hive provider. We'll have a style guide provider pretty soon. We just have a controllers provider. We don't have a controllers provider yet. I'm about to commit that. And then Utah API has the Mongo provider that's creating a whole bunch of things. So if you are looking for dependencies and where dependencies are created, it's most likely going to be inside of one of these providers or inside of these apps. We have all these Bootstrap stuff. You could look inside of those folders, whatnot. Okay?
So that reminds me, I have to create a user provider, but the user provider doesn't do the register like everything else. It gets users from the database. So it wouldn't really fit.
So the user provider, yes, this is a different type. This is not a Silex provider. This is a user provider. And yeah, theoretically, this providers folder is kind of for Silex providers. This would probably be in a different folder, but it's fine there. Whatever.
That probably goes in security.
Yeah, that probably does go in security. That's probably where I would have put it. Let's see. Services. Oh, services I've deleted since then. I got rid of services in Utah API because that wasn't services really. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's a lot
So
to.
providers are like a collection of services.
That's all it is. Yep, just a wrap around a collection of services. You can see in the controllers, they actually do mount up something. So this one's doing a little more than just providing services. It's mounting all those controllers and it's kind of defining your routes. But most of the time, they're just going to be providing services.
Only the controller provider interface has that connect.
Yeah. So what connect comes from provider interface. So I guess we could name this file service provider to differentiate or something. But provider is what it's called. Okay. Stop, Roger.